Book 3, God's Singer, Chapter 1, The Sermon to the Birds. It seems almost as if Francis, after he had seen the quiet, introspective, and happy life of St. Clara, and the first of her sisterhood led in San Damiano, was again inspired with doubts as to his vocation. Again did the doubt arise within him if it were not better to withdraw altogether from the world and to live alone for his soul's welfare, like the old anchorites. Many of his disciples had chosen this course, Sylvester, Rufino, and to some extent Giles. And although Francis was well aware of the dangers of the hermit life, spiritual arbitrariness and ascetic pride, the characteristic description can be read in the Fioretti, chapter 29. Yet it seems to him incontrovertible that the wandering life as preacher was preferable to what he called the accumulation of dust on the spiritual feet. To understand what Francis meant by this, we must follow him on his great missionary journey, which he undertook in the years 1211 to 1212. With Sylvester, he went to Tuscany, pacified the troubles in Perugia, was joined in Cortona by Guido Vagnotelli, and, if Wadding can be relied on, also by the celebrated and dreaded Elias Bombarone, established near the city a hermitage named Celle, and then wandered on to Arezzo and Florence. In the latter city, a celebrated jurist joined himself to him, Ioannis Parenti, a doctor of the University of Bologna and judge in Civita Castellana. Wadding, following Rudolphus, gives an anecdote about Parenti's entrance into the order. When on a walking tour he heard a swineherd driving his grunting hogs into the pen with the words, "Hurry up into the sty, pigs, as lawyers hurry into hell." The old proverb, "De juristen sin böse Christen," lawyers are poor Christians, seems to have been current in the 13th century. In any case, Parenti gave up his office and became a Franciscan, at about the same time as another Bolognese lawyer, Niccolo de Pepoli, took up with interest the Franciscan mission in Bologna itself. From Florence, Francis went on to Pisa, where Angelus, the subsequent general of the order, and Albert, later the leader of the brothers' English mission, joined him. He then returned back to Assisi by San Gimignano in the Valle d'Elsa, by Chiusi and Cortona, and after a full year's absence he gave the Lenten sermons in the cathedral, as already alluded to. But this last part of Francis's journey was almost a triumphal march. As he would approach a city, the bells were rung, the people went out to meet him with palm boughs in their hands, and conducted him in festival progress to the parish priest, with whom he always stayed. They brought bread for him to bless, to be afterwards preserved as a relic, and they repeated the cry which the Italians are so inclined to utter, "Behold, the saint!" Even the disciples found that this was too much. Sometimes they asked him, just as the chief priests and scribes had asked the Master, "Hearest thou what these say?" Francis used to answer that he regarded the homage paid him as analogous to the honor paid to pictures in churches, for the God-fearing man is only an image of God, and flesh and blood, like wood and stone, should not dare to ascribe themselves the honor which belongs to God alone. But eventually this was insufficient for him, and he sought therefore to abase himself as well as he could. "Do not praise me too soon," he liked to say, "for soon I shall have sons and daughters." Or he would break out, "Had God shown a street robber the love he has shown me, he would be much more thankful." He heartily thanked the Bishop of Terni when he once introduced one of Francis's sermons with a little introduction, in which he had developed the theme of how wonderful it was to see so insignificant and ungifted a man as Francis attain such great results. To those who praised his severe way of life, he said, "All that I do, a sinner can also do. A sinner can fast, can pray, can shed tears, can mortify the flesh. Only one thing a sinner cannot do: be true to his Lord and his God." For such faithlessness to God, Francis often upbraided himself and never concealed it. Once he had been sick, and while sick had eaten some chicken. Scarcely was he well again when he put a string around his neck and had himself led stripped to the village pillory, and while thus led, made the brother who led him cry out, "Here you see the great glutton who ate chicken without your knowing about it." And as the people only broke out into greater praise of his humility, he ordered one of the brothers to scold him vigorously, so that for once he could hear the truth. Much against his will, the brother upbraided him as a rustic, a hireling, and a useless servant, and with a contented smile, Francis answered him, "God bless thee for the word." That is what the son of Pietro di Bernardone ought to hear. On other occasions, Francis sought to escape the homage of the people by withdrawing into solitude. Thus he passed the whole of Lent, 1211, on an uninhabited island in Lake Trasimene, and he seems to have passed a great part of the following winter in the high-lying hermitage Sartiano near Chiusi. The huts, made of branches, which he with a few brothers built there, resembled mostly the dens of wild beasts, but Francis liked the place, partly for its wildness, partly for its loneliness, and finally because he could see from it Assisi in the distance. In this loneliness he was visited by great temptations, sometimes to despair. An interior voice said to him, "There is salvation for all except for a self-tormentor like you, someone to give up the state of celibacy and marry." Against this temptation he used an old practice of the anchorites. With a rope which he wore as a belt, he gave himself a dreadful beating on the bare back. But as Brother Ass, as Francis used to call his body, would give him no peace, he found another way. Outside of his cell the ground was covered with snow, and half naked as he was, Francis sprang out into the snow and began to build 7 snow images. When the work was done, he said to himself, "See, Francis, here is your wife, the big one over there. The 4 at her side are your 2 sons and 2 daughters, and the other 2 are your manservant and maid. They are dying of cold. Hurry up and put something on them. And if you cannot, then be glad that you have no one to serve except God alone." In one way or another, the idea of withdrawing entirely from the world engaged Francis's thoughts. He often discussed it with the brothers of the order and weighed the pro and con. There was one thing that always prevented him from choosing the hermit life, and that was the example of our Lord. Jesus could have chosen to remain in his glory at his Father's right hand, but instead descended to earth to endure the vicissitudes of human life and to die the bitter death of shame on the cross. And it was the cross that had from the first been Francis's model, the cross to which he applied with the rest of the Middle Ages God's word to Moses, "Fac secundum exemplar," make it according to the pattern that was shown thee in the mount. In his doubt, Francis resolved to ask a decision from God and to follow it blindly, whatever it might be. On other occasions he had opened the Bible and taken the sense of the text that met his eyes. This time he decided to submit himself to the inspiration of 2 privileged souls. Brother Maceo was therefore sent away, first to St. Clara and then to Brother Sylvester, who lived a hermit life in a cave on Monte Subasio, where now is situated the convent Carceri, in whose garden the first cells of the Franciscans are still shown. Francis determined to follow the judgment of Sylvester and Clara. But Brother Sylvester started at once to pray, we are told in Actus Beati Francisci, and in prayer he at once got the answer from God. And he went to Brother Maceo and said, "This says the Lord, you shall tell Brother Francis that God has not called him for his own sake only, but also that he shall win many souls." And then Brother Maceo went to St. Clara, but she answered and said that she and another sister had had the same answer exactly from God as Brother Sylvester. But Brother Maceo went back to St. Francis, and St. Francis received him lovingly and prepared for them a meal. And when they had eaten, Francis called him out into the woods, and St. Francis bared his head, crossed his arms over his chest, knelt down, asked and said, "What does my Lord Jesus Christ tell me to do?" Brother Maceo answered that both Brother Sylvester and Sister Clara and another had received the answer from Jesus Christ the Glorious, that thou shalt go out and preach, for God has not called you for your own sake alone, but also to save others. And then the hand of the Lord was lifted over St. Francis, and he sprang up in the glow of the Holy Ghost, and inspired by power from on high, he said to Brother Maceo, "Well, let us go." And he took Brother Maceo with him and Brother Angelo, both of whom were holy men, and they came between Canara and Bavagna. And St. Francis saw some trees by the roadside, and in these trees there was a multitude of birds of all kinds, such as never before were seen in this region. And a great quantity were on the ground under the trees. And when St. Francis saw all this multitude, the Spirit of God came over him, and he said to his disciples, "Wait for me here. I am going to preach to our sisters, the birds." And he walked into the field, up to the birds who sat upon the earth. And as soon as he began to preach, all the birds who sat in the trees flew down to him, and none of them moved, although he went right among them, so that his cowl touched several of them. But St. Francis said to the birds, "My sister birds, you owe God much gratitude, and ought always and everywhere to praise and exalt Him, because you can fly so freely wherever you want to, and for your double and threefold clothing, and for your colored and adorning coats, and for the food which you do not have to work for, and for the beautiful voices the Creator has given you. You sow not, neither do you reap, but God feeds you and gives you rivers and springs to drink from, and hills and mountains, cliffs and rocks to hide yourselves in, and high trees for you to build your nests in. And though you can neither spin nor weave, He gives you and your young ones the necessary clothing. Love therefore the Creator much, since He has given you such great blessings. Watch therefore well, my sister birds, that you are not ungrateful, but busy yourselves always in praising God." But after this, our Holy Father's word, all those little birds began to open their beaks, to beat with their wings, and stretch out their necks, and bow their heads reverently to the earth, and with their song and their movement showed that the word St. Francis had said had pleased them greatly. But St. Francis rejoiced in his spirit as he saw this, and wondered over so many birds, and over their variety and differences, and that they were so tame, and he praised the Creator for it, and gently exhorted them to praise the Creator themselves. And when St. Francis had finished his sermon and his exhortation to praise God, he made the sign of the cross over all the birds, and all the birds flew up at once, and twittered wonderfully and strongly, and separated and flew away. Chapter 2. Missionary Journeys. It was not now the intention of St. Francis to restrict himself to a new mission trip through Italy. He had greater plans, as he went out of Assisi this time, and in a sense it was his youthful dream of wars that returned to the man of 30 years. It was the time of the Crusades. Not many years later, John of Brienne, a brother of Francis's old-time hero Walter, was to go to Damietta at the head of a great army of Christians. Francis too would go on a crusade, but with no other weapon than the gospel. What he had in mind was no less than to preach Christianity and conversion to the Saracens. First he wished to obtain the Pope's assent to his new proposal. It is said of St. Dominic that he was always to be found on the road to Rome to obtain instructions. The same applies to Francis. 2 years after, he had obtained Innocent III's verbal ratification of the rules of the order. We find him again in Rome to remind the Pope of the promises he had then given. He could now well say that God had multiplied his brother's voice, and could therefore beg to have a greater mission given him. We know little of Francis's third journey to Rome. On the way he visited Alviano near Todi, where he, preaching in the marketplace, is said to have ordered the swallows swooping about and disturbing him with their cries to be silent. Perhaps he also went through Narni and Toscanella. In Rome, Francis preached as usual in the streets and alleys. With these sermons he won 2 new brothers, Zacharias, who afterwards became a missionary in Spain, and William, the first Englishman who entered the order. Far more important for the whole future of the order was the friendship Francis here contracted with a woman whom he later, on account of her manly character, called jokingly Brother Jacoba, the wife of the Roman nobleman Graziano Frangipani. Her name was Giacoma or Jacopa dei Settisoli, and she was about 25 years old. The Frangipani family is one of the noblest in Rome. It is said to have sprung from the gens Anicia, which counts among its members in the course of years a Benedict of Nursia, a Paulinus of Nola, and St. Gregory. In the year 717, Flavius Anicius Petrus, then the head of the family, by generous gifts of bread during a great scarcity of food in Rome, won the name of the Breaker of Bread. In the beginning of the 13th century, the Frangipanis lived in Rome with extensive estates in the Trans-Tiberian region and on the Esquiline, where they possessed, among the rest of their property, the castle-like remains of the Septizonium of Septimus Severus, a name which in a changed form still lives in the title of the Roman street Via della Sette Sale, and from which Graziano Frangipani's wife acquired her name de Sette Soli. Giacoma is said to have been of a mixture of Norman and Sicilian blood. She was probably born about 1190, for in 1210 she was married and had a son, Giovanni. Afterwards she had another son, Graziano, in 1217, shortly after her husband's death. Already in the year 1212 she had made the acquaintance of Francis of Assisi, an acquaintance which, on the next visit of the Umbrian evangelist to Rome, was to develop into a true and inward friendship. Francis had certainly little trouble in obtaining Innocent III's blessing on his work. He embarked on the sea, we do not know from which port. Storms drove the ship off her course, and she stranded on the coast of Slavonia. There was no way of embarking thence for the Orient. It was late in the year, and the weather was also unfavorable for the sea crossing. Francis tried to get a ship for Ancona, but the seamen were unwilling to load a ship with him and his followers. They then formed the plan of hiding themselves among the ship's cargo without the crew knowing it. They emerged only after the ship was on the open sea, and as the voyage on account of unfavorable weather lasted longer than was expected, and the ship's rations became exhausted, the 2 hidden passengers obtained permission to share their rations with the crew. Hardly had Francis's feet touched Italian soil when he took up his old way of life and went preaching from city to city. In Ascoli his preaching had such effect that over 30 men, some priests, some laymen, sought to be received into the brotherhood. Elsewhere he was surrounded as before by the jubilations and crowds of people. They strove at least to touch the skirt of his garment. Only the Cathari, also diffused through the Ancona region, kept away from him. For the kernel of his preaching, as of all his religious life, was the absolute, unconditional, and in all unessential things, blind obedience to the Roman Church, and the principal sequence thereof, a deep reverence for the priests of the same Church. It was with timely retrospect over this and similar missionary journeys that Francis, in his Testament, has written words about the poor minor priests in the parishes about, whom he, in spite of all, will fear, love, and honor as his masters, and not look upon their faults. This last was what the Cathari wanted. They expatiated long and loud over the sins of the priests, and thus took many out of that church which the priests represented. Francis was of that rare nature that can discriminate between things and persons, and he knew how to inspire the same spirit in his brethren. But how can a priest lie, Brother Giles asked in this spirit, incensed over so unreasonable a supposition. While in Ancona this time, Francis converted a celebrated man of that time, the troubadour Guglielmo Divini, called by the people the Verse King. Divini was on a visit to the little village San Severino in Mark Ancona, where he had a relative, a nun. Francis was preaching in the convent at the time, and the celebrated poet heard him there. There was, according to all testimony, something very impressive in Francis's way of speaking. It was not so much a sermon, says Thomas of Spalato, as a concio, a lecture that touched on practical and moral reform. And Francis was an unbending moralist. He was not silent about wrongs that he saw, but gave everything its right name. In spite of his poor external appearance, he inspired thereby not only wonder, but also fright. There was something of John the Baptist about him. In his writings there is many a woe to the sinner, whose wages are eternal fire. He was not afraid to threaten with God's punishment. His words were compared to a sword that pierces through hearts. So Guglielmo Divini heard the celebrated preacher of repentance in the cloister in San Severino. The poet came from curiosity, and a crowd of the gay youth of the village with him. At first Francis did not impress them greatly, but the Verse King soon began to listen. It seemed to him as if the poor little man from Assisi talked to him alone, as if all the words he heard were directed to him, and one after another, like well-aimed arrows, sent by a master hand, thrust their points into his heart. What did Francis talk about? It was on his usual theme, to despise the world, and to be converted so as to withstand the coming wrath. And when he was through, the simple and great thing at once happened. And Guglielmo Divini rose up, fell at the feet of Francis, and cried out, "Brother, take me away from men, and give me to God." On the next day Francis clothed him in the grey clothes of the order, and girded his loins with the cord, and gave him the name Pacificus, because he had left the world's tumult for the peace of God. Thus too, a century later, another much greater poet was to seek for peace among the children of St. Francis. One evening he, already grey and bowed down, stood before a lonely cloister in the Apennines and knocked at the door. And to the porter's question as to what he sought there, the great Florentine, Dante, gave only the one all-including answer: Pace, peace. Although Francis thus received every one with a troubled heart who came to him, and without further novitiate clothed him in the order's garb, it was in 1220 that a year's trial or novitiate was established. He had a wonderful ability at discriminating among the many who began to wish to be received among the brothers. A short period had elapsed after Pacificus's conversion, when a young nobleman from Lucca sought Francis, and with tears cast himself at his feet, and asked to be one of his sons. Francis addressed him with severity. "Your weeping is a lie," he said. "Your heart does not belong to God. Why do you lie to the Holy Ghost and to me?" Thus it appeared that the longing for the cloister was only a caprice of the young man, perhaps conceived in a moment of dissatisfaction with the conditions of home. When his parents came to beg him to come back, he readily complied. Especially was Francis on his guard with the book-learned viri literati. "When such a bookman comes to me," he said openly, "I see at once if his intentions are sincere when his first prayer to me is this one: Behold, brother, I have lived long in the world, and never rightly knew my God. Give me a place far from the world's alarms, where I, in the bitterness of heart, can think over the years I have lost and squandered, to live a better life in the future." It was only for the disinherited of this world, the poor and oppressed, the unfortunate and lost, the lepers, thieves and robbers, that Francis's heart was open without reservation. It is true that the Benedictine rules contained at this time the words, "All strangers shall be received as if it were Christ." But Francis himself had found by trial in his youth that this command was not always lived up to, that it was observed in the case of guests who could claim a position in society, but that it was not observed in the case of those who needed it the most, the homeless, the tramps, and the beggars. It is certain that with the experiences of his youth at St. Maria della Rocca in mind, Francis in his rule at the very beginning wrote the beautiful words, "And whoever comes to the brethren, friend or enemy, thief or robber, shall be kindly received." Even his most devoted disciples had trouble sometimes in following him in this matter. The Speculum Perfectionis contains the following impressive tale from the early days of the order. In a hermitage over Borgo San Sepolcro, Monte Casale is meant. Borgo San Sepolcro is a village about halfway between Mount Alverna and Gubbio. It happened that robbers who used to keep in the woods and fall upon wayfarers came and asked for bread. But some of the brothers said that it was not right to give them alms. Meanwhile St. Francis came to this convent, and the brothers asked him if it were right to give alms to robbers. And St. Francis answered them thus: "If you do as I say, then have I hope in God that I will save their souls. Go then and get good bread and good wine. Take it out to them in the woods and say to them, Brother robbers, come here, we are brothers, and we come with good wine and good bread to you. Then they will come at once, and I will spread a cloth on the ground and set the table for them, and wait on them with humility and cheerfulness while they eat. But when they are through, I will speak God's word to them, and finally I shall beg them to grant you a request in God's name, namely, that they shall promise you not to kill anyone, and to do bodily harm to no one. If I ask anything of them, at once they will answer no, but now for the sake of your humility and goodness, they will promise you this. The next day, in requital of their good promises, you shall go out to them with bread and wine, eggs and fruit, and wait upon them while they eat. And when they have finished, you shall say to them, Why do you wander about all day and suffer hunger and endure so much, and in thought and deed perpetrate so many things, and imperil your souls? It is much better to serve the Lord, then He will give you what you need here upon earth, and at the same time you will save your souls. Then the Lord will grant them that, for the sake of your humility and patience, they will be converted." But the brothers did all just as St. Francis had said, and the robbers, from thankfulness and with God's mercy, held point for point and jot for jot what the brothers had enjoined them. Yes, for the sake of the humility and confidence of the brothers, they helped them and carried wood into the hermitage. And eventually some of them entered the order, but others confessed their sins and did penance for their transgressions, and promised the brothers solemnly to live by the work of their hands, and never to do such things again. As this tale, one of the oldest remains we possess, lies before us, it gives us a full conception both of Francis's knowledge of men. He knew that it was useless to preach to a hungry man. He knew also that Rome was not built in a day, and of his unpharisaical love of men. Here is one of the moments in the history of Christendom when the words of the gospel are understood exactly as they were said. "And if you love them that love you, what reward shall you have? Do not even the publicans this? But do good without expecting anything from it, and your reward shall be great, and you shall be the sons of the Highest, for he is kind to the unthankful and to the evil." If Francis was thus indulgent to the last degree with great sinners, so on the other hand he put good people to a severe test. From those to whom much was given he expected much. The Fioretti have preserved for us many incidents which illustrate this characteristic in him. Such demeanor in the case of Rufino, who belonged to one of Assisi's best families, and whom he ordered to go naked from Portiuncula to the city, and to preach naked in the cathedral. A similar command was that which he gave to Brother Agnolo, near Borgo San Sepolcro, who belonged to that place, and who, like Rufino, was of good family. He too was to go naked into the town, and announce that Francis would come next day and preach there. But he was called back as he was approaching the city gate, and Francis promised him paradise for the readiness with which he had humiliated himself. Little is known with certainty of Francis of Assisi's journeys during the next few years. Wadding has, with admirable sagacity, tried to put into order all the fragmentary pieces which constitute the biographical material for these years, so as to form an artificial mosaic, but he failed in the attempt. And when he, for example, assumes that Francis was sick in Assisi in the winter of 1212 to 1213, and sent out from his sickbed his letters to all Christians, it confuses the occasion with much later events. We can with some certainty believe that Francis pursued his journey through Italy. However this may be, we meet him in the beginning of 1213 on a similar mission, a journey in the province of Romagna. In this region, not far from the little republic of San Marino, there was in olden times a nobleman's castle called Montefeltro, now Sasso Feltrio, near the city of San Leo. Francis and his companion, probably Leo, came to this city on a beautiful May morning, just as the banners flying from the towers and the proud blare of the trumpets announced a great festival. Gaily dressed pages and men-at-arms hastened over the drawbridge. Knights on powerful chargers, brightly caparisoned, thronged under the gateway. Swinging carriages bore ladies young and old, with laced bodices and high headdresses up the steep road to the castle. Everything indicated that a festive tourney was to be held, to which all the nobility of the district was invited. All the splendor here displayed did not irritate Brother Francis. Pious people are addicted to this failing, so that Francis was wont to warn his disciples against judging and despising those who went in costly clothes and lived in luxury. "God is also their master," said he. He can call them when He will, and make them just and holy. Had not this happened to Him? Therefore He stood there a little while and looked at the banner that waved over the gate with the bearings of the barons of Montefeltro. He then turned with a smile to his companion. "What do you think? Should we too go up to the festival? Perhaps we can win a good knight for God's cause." It was done as he said. The occasion of the festival was the knighting of a young soldier. All attended Mass, during which the young man took the pledges of knighthood, and then Francis ascended some steps in the castle garden and began to speak. As his text, he had chosen some words in the dialect of the people, a simple doggerel such as children use, the two following lines: "Tanto è et bene chic aspetto, ch'ogni pena me diletto." I hope that I so blessed will be, that every suffering pleases me. One can easily imagine that Francis, grown up as he was in the atmosphere of the romances of King Arthur and the Knights of the Round Table, developed this text somewhat in the following manner. "The knight," he began, "who wants to win a lovely dame, must be ready to undergo great and many sufferings. She may require of him that he shall go on a crusade against the Sultan, perhaps that he shall bring her a horn of the unicorn, or an egg of the bird called the roc, perhaps that he shall set free a captive maiden, or ride a fully equipped charger over a bridge which is so small that one can hardly walk across it, while under it pours a wild torrent. And all these dangers and sufferings the true and noble knight is ready to undergo, only because his dear lady wishes it, and through all his tribulations he thinks only of her white hand that she will give him to kiss when he goes back with deeds well done, and immediately his despondency and gloom are over. But now there is another and far nobler knighthood, to which all men are called, and not only those of noble birth. There is another battle, not to win the favor of an earthly beauty, but to do the will of the eternal and highest beauty, who is God. For is not God far more beautiful than all the beautiful ladies? For they are all the work of His hands, made out of the dust of the earth. Is not He who made so much that is beautiful, is not He still more beautiful than all His creatures? Yet He is that, and therefore He also deserves that you go out as knight-errants for Him, and fight valorously for His honor against the enemies who are the world, the flesh, and the devil. And what will He not give us, if we have been faithful to Him, like a knight to his lady-love, and do not permit ourselves to be cast down in His service by any obstacle or suffering? He gives us infinitely more than even the most beautiful dame can give. She has only herself, her hand, and her heart, but the hand shall wither, and the heart shall fail sometime. But when God gives Himself as the prize for the victory, as the shining prize for the winner of the joust, then He gives us life, light, and happiness in imperishable, immortal eternity. It was about in this way that Brother Francis spoke, and his words may well have moved many a young and noble heart. But one among them, and this was Duke Orlando dei Catani of the castle of Chiusi in Casentino, approached Francis and said, "Father, I want to talk to you about the salvation of my soul." But Francis, who gave God's Spirit time to work upon souls, had no haste, but answered, "Go first and hold festivities with your friends, wherever you may be invited. After that, we will talk in peace and quiet." When the tourney was over, the young Duke again visited Francis, and they talked together. But at the end of the conversation, the Duke Orlando said, "I own a mountain in Tuscany, which is called Laverna, a very lonely mountain, well adapted to meditation. if you would wish to build there, you and your brothers, then for my soul's sake will I give it to you. But St. Francis, thus it is told us in the Actus Beati Francisci, greatly wished to find lonely places where it was good to pray. Therefore he thanked first of all God, who with his faithful took care of his lambs. And thereafter he thanked Lord Orlando, and said, Lord Duke, when you go back to your home, I will send 2 of my brothers to you, and you can show them this mountain, and if it seems suited to prayer and meditation, then I will be very grateful to you for your friendly offer. For the present, Francis himself did not go to inspect the Duke Orlando's gift, for again did the crown of martyrdom beckon to him from afar. He had not succeeded in going to the Holy Land. Now he thought of bringing the gospel to the Mussulman on the further side of the Mediterranean Sea, in Morocco. Sultan Mohammed ben Nasser, the Mir Molan, as the Christians by an anagram on the title Emir el-Mu'minin, the ruler of the faithful, were wont to call him, had been beaten by the Spaniards at Tolosa and was forced to retreat to Africa. Here Francis determined to visit him and started on the journey, probably in the winter of 1213 to 1214. He traveled across Spain, but fell sick as he reached the end of his journey, and again had to return home with his object unattained. On reaching Portiuncula, he took several new brothers into the order, among them Thomas of Celano. The year after this fruitless mission to the heathen, Francis seems to have been present at the Fourth Lateran Council. He obtained in all probability on this occasion Innocent III's ratification of Clares and her sister's privilege of poverty. It was about the same time that the French prelate Jacques de Vitry passed through Italy on his way to the Holy Land, and then made the acquaintance of the first Friars Minor. In a letter sent from Genoa in October 1216 to his friends at home, the French canon thus expresses himself: In the time that I spent at the Curia, the papal court in Perugia, I saw much that I was entirely dissatisfied with. All was so taken up with worldly and temporary affairs, of politics and law, that it was hardly possible to get in a word of spiritual affairs. There was one thing, however, which comforted me in these surroundings. Many men and women, among them many rich and worldly, have for Christ's sake forsaken everything and fled from the world. They are called Friars Minor, and stand in high repute both with the Pope and Cardinals. But they take no heed of temporal things, but work day in and day out with zeal and diligence to draw souls away from the vanities of the world, so that they will not fall to the ground, and to take them along with themselves. And with the favor of God, they have already reaped a rich harvest. But they live after the example of the primitive man of whom it is written, "The multitude of the faithful were of one heart and one mind." By day they labor and go into the cities and highways to capture souls, but at night they turn back to waste places and lonely regions, where they give themselves up to prayer. The women abide together in various retreats in the vicinity of the cities. They receive nothing, but live from the work of their hands. But the men of this order come together once a year with great provision to a predetermined place, to hold a feast together, and to rejoice in the Lord, and with the support of good men they ordain and announce their laws, which the Pope ratifies. After this they disperse, and for the entire year are in Lombardy and Tuscany and Apulia and Sicily. But a holy and God-fearing man, Nicholas, the Pope's secretary, recently forsook the Curia and went to them, but was called back because the Pope could not do without him. In the summer of 1216, the papal court was stationed in Perugia, and as can be seen from the last lines of Jacques de Vitry's sketch, the movement started by Francis began to spread up to the highest hierarchy. The Bishop Nicholas here spoke of was Bishop of Tusculum, later Cardinal Nicholas Chiaramonti, of whom we know that he was very friendly to the Franciscans and liked to have one of them with him. Perhaps it was at the same time that another cardinal paid his first visit to the Friars Minor. This was Cardinal Ugolino of Ostia, and afterwards a friend and tireless protector of the order. He came to Portiuncula, as we are told in the Speculum Perfectionis, where the brothers were holding a conference, with a large band of followers, both clerks and soldiers. But when he saw how poorly the brothers lived, and that they slept upon straw and ate from the bare earth, he was so overcome that he broke into tears and cried out, "How will it go with us who live so luxuriously day after day, in superfluity and delights?" It is certain that the time was approaching for a nearer relation between Francis and the papal court to be established. The road from Perugia, where the Curia, as already said, was held for the greater part of the summer of 1216, to Portiuncula is not long, and there seems to have been reciprocal visits. It was in this summer that the majority of his biographers are unanimous in placing one of the most contested affairs in the life of Francis of Assisi. In the first days of the pontificate of Honorius III, God's poor little man from Assisi knelt before Christ's vicar and begged for the celebrated Portiuncula indulgence. Chapter 3. The Portiuncula Indulgence. It is first of all necessary to observe that the Church of Rome, previous to the establishment of the Portiuncula indulgence, had only one plenary indulgence, the one granted to those who took up the cross and joined the ranks of the Crusaders. Everyone who did this and fulfilled the requirements of confessing his sins and obtained absolution from a priest, obtained complete remission of the Church's penances, as well as of the punishment of purgatory, so that his soul could appear before God directly after death. This indulgence of the Crusade, Indulgentia de Terra Sancta, was later extended so as to apply to anyone who, for one reason or another, did not personally join the ranks of the Crusaders, but with money or with armed men sustained the holy war. It was also the Franciscans, something which in this connection is of the greatest importance, who obtained from the Pope the right of distributing this indulgence, extended as above stated. Whenever the Church decreed an indulgence in other cases, as on the consecration of a church, it was done in a distinctively different form. The Lateran Council of 1215 had imposed further restrictions on this custom. On the consecration of a church, the Council decreed, an indulgence of only 1 year canonical penance should be granted, and on the recurring anniversaries of the consecration, only one of 40 days. At the consecration of the Church of St. Francis in Assisi, there was granted as something quite extraordinary an indulgence of 3 years to all who had come over the sea to take part in the festival, and of 2 years to those who had crossed the Alps, while the ordinary pilgrim had to be content with the usual indulgence of 1 year. What is it then that Francis, in contrast to this, tried to get from the Pope, or better, did obtain from him? If we give credence to the authorities, he presented himself one fine day, accompanied by Brother Maceo of Marignano, before Honorius II, and begged for the Portiuncula Church the same indulgence granted to the Crusaders in the Holy Lands. "I desire," he is said to have announced to the Pope, "that everyone who, with penitence for his sins, comes into this church and confesses his sins and is absolved by the priest, shall be free from all guilt and punishment for the sins of his life from the day of his baptism to the day when he entered the said church. It was in vain that the Pope urged that the Roman Curia was not accustomed to grant such indulgences to any church. It was vain that he offered to Francis one of the ordinary indulgences. Francis could not be moved, as he declared that the Lord himself had sent him in order to obtain this indulgence. Then the Pope suddenly, as if by the divine guidance, yielded the point, and now it remained to the cardinals, as Honorius depicted the injury it might do to the indulgence of the crusade, to restrict the new indulgence. It was to be valid for only one day in each year, from the vespers of the evening before through the full 24 hours following until sunset. Francis departed contented, and when the Pope asked him if he did not want a written authorization, he said it was superfluous, for God will know how to bring His own work into the light. With this relation for a foundation, a group of legends has been built up, to which belong the Rose legend, depicted by Overbeck on the facade of the Portiuncula chapel. These adornments of the recital first appear in works of the 14th century. What is given above can be referred to earlier sources. At the first glance, this narration seems very probable in itself. Every biographer of Francis tells us how he loved his dear Portiuncula, and we also know how zealous he was for the conversion of sinners. He once saw in a vision how men from all places, near and far, came in streams around the little Portiuncula, and one of his disciples had a similar vision. Again, the dislike of documents is a characteristic of Francis. In 1210, he was satisfied with the verbal ratification of Innocent III, and at the Lateran Council he got nothing more. When Orlando dei Catani gave him Laverna, this too was done without any writing, as it is explicitly stated in the letter of gifts of the young Count Catani in 1274. In his testament, Francis forbids most definitely his brothers to seek written privileges from the Curia, whether for a church or for any other place. It is perfectly clear that such an answer as Francis gave to Honorius, according to the old story, is quite in the spirit of St. Francis. It is quite another question if Francis really gave this answer, in other words, if such an interview ever took place. First and foremost, we must here remark that none of the undoubtedly authentic authorities of the 13th century contain a single reference to the Portiuncula indulgence. Thomas of Celano knows the indulgence which Gregory IX granted to the Church of St. Francis in Assisi, but neither he nor the old biographers of St. Francis have the least inkling of the existence of the Portiuncula indulgence. It is only much more recent authorities who assert that this indulgence could be gained every year since 1216, on days appointed by Honorius III, namely from the evening of August the 1st to the evening of the 2nd. This remarkable silence of the official biographers may be regarded as the sequence of the non-existing papal bull, or as a result of the opposition of Elias of Cortona and of his party to the Portiuncula men, the strict division of the order. The biographers in question had to serve the party in power. If this was the correct conclusion, on the other hand, we should expect to find the Portiuncula indulgence in the place of honor in the legend originating in the ranks of the strict division, as in the Speculum Perfectionis or in the Fioretti. But it is in vain that one looks even here for a trace of the legend given above. The tradition of the indulgence naturally can be referred, if not in the direct, then in the secondary line, to Brother Leo and the other intimate friends of St. Francis, and in the first rank stands the testimony taken in the presence of numerous witnesses on October 31st, 1277, and signed by a notary public in Arezzo, as given by two Franciscans, Brother Benedict of Arezzo, who formerly was with St. Francis when he still lived, and Brother Rayner of Arezzo, who declared himself a confidential friend of Brother Maceo from Marignano. In this document, the two Franciscans testify that they had heard from Brother Maceo, who was the truth itself, how he and Francis went together to Perugia, and obtained from Pope Honorius the above described indulgence, although the Pope said that the Apostolic Throne was not one to give such an indulgence. The recital is very short, and the document is provided with a date which is quite complete and in all particulars correct. The original is no longer in existence. Sabatier maintains that one of the copies now in Assisi dates from the end of the 13th century. Various other recitals of the same period rest upon the testimony of Brother Maceo through the intermediary of Brother Benedict of Arezzo. Sabatier has inserted them in his edition of Francesco Bartoli's book on the Portiuncula indulgence of about 1435. But if they originate with Brother John of Laverna, or with Brother Otto of Acquasparta, they contain nothing new. It is only a new appearance of the original source, Maceo Benedict, which we find in various places. That an old man, Pietro Zalfani, in his youth claims to have been present at the consecration of the Portiuncula church, and that he says that he there saw Francis standing with a paper in his hand, amounts to but little. Another group of witnesses of about the same time depends upon Brother Leo instead of Brother Maceo. A nobleman of Perugia, Jacopo Coppoli, who on February 14, 1276, gave the Perugian Franciscans the hill on which their old convent, Monte Ripido, stands, testifies at about this same time, and in a similar form to that of Brother Benedict of Arezzo, that he had heard Brother Leo tell about the Portiuncula indulgence. In the narration of Coppoli, the Pope offers to Francis an indulgence of 7 years without satisfying him. He then offered the indulgence de terra sancta, but the cardinals caused him to limit it. After Francis had told this to Brother Leo, he told him to say nothing of the indulgence for the present, for this indulgence shall remain hidden for a while. The Lord will in good time bring it out and reveal it. Wadding places, and certainly correctly, this testimony in the year 1277. This was 2 generations after the granting of the indulgence. It is clear that within the order, or rather within its stricter party, to which Benedict of Arezzo belonged, the effort was made, first as strongly as possible, to prove the existence of the Portiuncula indulgence, and secondly, to explain why the indulgence was not announced sooner. For this reason, Brother Benedict had his testimony affirmed by a notary, and Jacob Coppoli's testimony was given in the presence of numerous witnesses before the provincial minister for Umbria, Brother Angelo, 1270–1280. It was also about this time, or a little earlier, that Brother Francis of Fabriano obtained himself the Portiuncula indulgence, and he tells also that he received from Brother Leo the tale of how Francis obtained it from the Pope. It is definitely certain that Francis of Fabriano wrote the work to which we refer in his later years, for he quotes a document which at the earliest may be of 1310. Brother Francis, who was born in 1251 and died in 1322, was 60 or 70 years old when he put down his reminiscences. There is no reason to doubt that Francis of Fabriano was in Portiuncula in the year referred to. We cannot set aside the explanation that in his advanced age he may have had the indulgence as the object of his pilgrimage. From the beginning, many Franciscans made the pilgrimage to the grave of their spiritual father and to Portiuncula, and in this connection it is of the greatest significance that Pope Nicholas IV, himself a Franciscan, speaks in a letter of May 14, 1284, of the numerous crowd of brothers who stream to Assisi, but never names the Portiuncula indulgence as the reason of their going. According to this Pope, the Church of San Francesco, containing the saint's tomb, as well as the Portiuncula chapel, were the objects of pilgrimage and not the indulgence, all being done to honor the saint. This accords with the fact that Angela of Foligno, 1248-1309, soon after she entered the Third Order of St. Francis, made a pilgrimage to Assisi, but on this occasion never speaks of Portiuncula, but tells of 2 visits to the memorial church of San Francesco, and she is known to have been of the strict observance. The great chief of this party, Hubert of Casale, visited her shortly before her death, and speaks of her in the prologue to his Arbor Vitae with the greatest reverence. Naturally, Angela's visit to Assisi may have fallen in a time of the year when the indulgence was not to be obtained. She may have not been there on the 1st or 2nd day of August. Still, it is strange that she never says a word about Portiuncula. Everything indicates that the Portiuncula indulgence first began to be known only in the last quarter, in the last third, if we accept Francis of Fabriano's words, of the 13th century. If it were allowable to apply modern conceptions to the ways of those days, we might be tempted to place the origin of the indulgence at the 50-year jubilee of the granting of the indulgence, 1212-1264. Francis of Fabriano's visit was made in 1268. It is certain that as soon as the indulgence became known, it awakened opposition. Hence the notarial declarations of Benedict of Arezzo, Rainier, Copoli, Zolfani, even the great leaders of the strict Franciscan observance, Peter John Olivi, 1248-1298, took up the question of the indulgence. In a small, unfortunately undated pamphlet, he strives to uphold its authenticity, first on dogmatic and then on historic grounds. Unfortunately, the historic portion is lost. It is not to be wondered at that in this dispute several Catholic investigators doubted or even denied the origin of the indulgence to have been with St. Francis, so inadequately is it proved. Even the author of this book was once of the same opinion, and so expressed himself in the first edition of the same. According to my views at that time, the Portiuncula indulgence was only a localized indulgence de terra sancta, or Crusaders' indulgence. Thus, when the Holy Land was lost, Saint Jean d'Acre fell 1291, being the last stronghold of the Christians. The indulgence of the Crusade, which the Pope had permitted the Franciscans to share, could only be obtained in Portiuncula. It was natural that the 2nd of August should be chosen as the day for granting the indulgence, as this was the anniversary of the consecration of the Church. Such a choice was not un-Franciscan. On August the 1st is celebrated the festival of St. Peter's Chains. Francis of Assisi's reverence for the saint was well known, and in the Mass of this day in the Collect is this passage: O God, who didst let the blessed Peter the Apostle depart free and uninjured from his bonds, we beg thee to free us from the bonds of our sins. In the little Portiuncula chapel, the new Terra Sancta, the Franciscans, by virtue of the authorization already obtained, shared on these days the same plenary indulgence which formerly belonged to the Crusaders, and led penitent pilgrims out of the valley of sin and punishment into the Holy Land of innocence. In the 4 years which have passed since this chapter in my book was written, a most meritorious investigator of Franciscan history, Reverend Herbert Holzefeld in Munich, has developed new viewpoints for the consideration of this question. Father Holzefeld agrees that in the lifetime of St. Francis, the indulgence in question was little known and little used. It must impress us, he writes, that all later authorities only mention the fact that the indulgence was secured by St. Francis, but never say that it was much frequented either in the lifetime of the saint nor during the first decade following his death. Some causes must then have been operative which, in the beginning at least, hindered the dissemination of the indulgence. In seeking these causes we are driven into the region of conjecture. I may be permitted to suggest the following solution for discussion. The Pope conceded the indulgence only after long persuasion. As we learn from later authorities, the cardinals were decided enemies of the proposition, as were the bishops of the vicinity, that is, in Assisi, Foligno, Perugia, Gubbio, etc. These bishops, says Father Holzapfel, did not wish such an extraordinary demonstration of favor for the insignificant Portiuncula chapel, and expressed themselves to St. Francis on the subject in various ways, and the more as they doubtless knew the feeling of the Curia. It would be in exact accord with the spirit of St. Francis that he would remain silent from his reverence for the priesthood. His was no combative nature, and here, as in other instances, yielded. That he did it willingly we do not assert. It may have hurt him, like many another thing that he had to yield to and could not change. He will have spoken also of the disappointment with his trusted companions. He will have comforted himself with the prospects of a better future, and have exhorted them for the present to practice patient submission. This does not exclude the possibility that the few friars sharing his knowledge or similar people in the world may have used the indulgence as granted. Only we must not think of a wide dissemination of it. The circle of those knowing of it would grow with time, and consequently the frequentation of the indulgence, but also the opposition of its enemies. Then the friars who were still living felt it their duty to leave authentic proof of what they knew so well. They need fear no longer the enmity of the Curia, which was very friendly to the order, nor the enmity of the bishops, at least not of the directly interested bishops of Assisi, who for some time had been Franciscans. This hypothesis explains the silence of the biographers. If, moreover, the Speculum Perfectionis, which was written in the year 1318, when the indulgence was perfectly known on all sides, never mentions it, why should the silence of the early biographers prove anything against the existence of the indulgence at the period when they wrote? As in so many other questions of Franciscan investigation, we here have to refer to approved authorities of the olden times. Chapter 4, Chapters and Provinces. The community of brothers which Francis of Assisi had founded was from the very first an order of penitents and apostles, and Francis himself was the superior of the order. He it was who had written the rules of the order and had promised obedience to the Pope. He it was to whom the permission to preach was given, and through whom the others participated therein. It is certain that the first 6 brothers had the same right as Francis to receive new members into the order, but the new members were taken to Portiuncula, there to receive the robe of penitence from Francis himself. This reception into the brotherhood was regarded as equivalent in weight to the old-time conversio of the orders of monkhood. By it one left the world with its pomp and glory. As a sign of this, the supplicant gave his possessions to the poor. Again, from the very first, Francis had liked to have his brothers about him as much as possible. When the first disciples were sent out on their mission journeys, he had accordingly arranged a time, statuto termino, when they should all again meet at Portiuncula. Later there were arranged once for all 2 such terms in the year, when all the brothers should meet at Portiuncula, at Pentecost, and on the feast of St. Michael, September 29th. Of these two meetings, or as they were called, using an expression from the older days of convent life, chapters, Pentecost chapter was the most important. Then all the brothers came together and discussed how best they should maintain the rule. They held a feast in frugality and joy, after which Francis preached. His admonitiones, or admonitions, which will be spoken of later, evidently originated at these chapter meetings. They explained perhaps a text from the Sermon on the Mount, or sentences such as, "For he that will save his life shall lose it. I am not here to be served, but to serve. He who doth not renounce all that he possesseth cannot be my disciple." Most often, the most willingly, he spoke on his favorite theme, reverence for the sacrament of the altar, and the reverence for priests which flows from it. Sometimes he would have the brothers kiss the head of the horse a priest rode on, and always have peace in your hearts, you who come to bring others peace. If therefore any disciple felt disturbed by temptations, he went to the Master and took him into his confidence, and none went away uncomforted. To the last, Francis undertook the choosing of preachers whom he afterwards sent to the various mission districts or provinces, as the expression became later. In this choosing, he was led only by considerations of the fitness of the one recommended, and sent out lay brothers as willingly as priests. With all his overflowing fatherly heart, he finally blessed them all, and 2 by 2 they went off gladly into the world, like strangers and like pilgrims, without other burden than the books they needed to say their office out of. Francis's always strongly personal preaching at these meetings often approached the poetical. This passage from one of his admonitions, unmistakably recalling the Church Maundy Thursday hymn, Ubi caritas et amor Deus ibi est, may in this connection be cited here. Where charity is and wisdom is neither fear nor ignorance. Where patience is and humility is neither unquiet nor anger. Where poverty is and joy is neither cupidity nor covetousness. Where the fear of the Lord stands at the door, the evil enemy cannot enter. Where compassion is and prudence is neither waste nor hardness of heart. Like all model Christians, Francis turned with special devotion to the Blessed Virgin and Mother of God, Mary. And troubadour as he was, he sang one of his most beautiful lauds in praise of all the virtues with which the Blessed Virgin was adored, and which should be the ornaments of all holy souls. "Hail, Queen Wisdom," he cries, "the Lord save thee with thy sister, holy pure Simplicity. Lady, holy Poverty, the Lord save thee with thy sister, holy Humility. The Lord save thee with thy sister, holy Obedience. All you most holy virtues, may the Lord from whom you proceed and come save you. Holy Wisdom confounds Satan and all his wickednesses. Pure holy Simplicity confounds all the wisdom of this world and the wisdom of the flesh. Holy Poverty confounds all cupidity and avarice and the cares of this world. Holy Humility confounds pride and all men of this world and all things which are in the world. Holy Charity confounds all diabolical and carnal temptations and all carnal fears. Holy Obedience confounds all corporal and carnal wishes, and keeps the body mortified to the obedience of the Spirit and to the obedience of its brother, and makes man subject to all men of this world, and not only to men, but even to all animals and beasts." From this praise of all virtues, which inevitably reminds one of Giotto's exaltation of the holy Obedience, the holy Chastity, and the holy Poverty in the frescoes over the grave of St. Francis in Assisi, the poet takes his flight up to the throne of the purest Virgin. Hail, Holy Lady, most Holy Queen, Mary, Mother of God, who art a Virgin forever, chosen from heaven by the most Holy Father, whom He consecrated with the most Holy Beloved Son and the Paraclete Spirit, in whom was and is all plenitude of grace and all good. Hail His palace, hail His tabernacle, hail His house, hail His vesture, hail His handmaid, hail His mother, and all you holy virtues, which by grace and illumination of the Holy Ghost you may pour into the hearts of the faithful, and may you make out of the faithless ones men faithful to God. After having ended such a song of praise to Mary, taken as the Christian ideal, it may have been that Francis cried out, "We friars minor, what are we other than God's singers and players, who seek to draw hearts upward and to fill them with spiritual joy, to play good people into heaven, to sing before everyone's door about the beauty and delight of serving the Lord?" This Francis had tried personally in Assisi, and he assigned the same troubadour's ways to his brothers. "Do you not know, dearest brother," he asked Brother Giles, "that holy contrition, and holy humility, and holy charity, and holy joy make the soul good and happy?" There were many who in St. Francis of Assisi's time did not know this, and therefore God's singers, Joculatores Dei, went out into the world to sing this into the hearts of men. From the beginning, the chapter meetings were thus practically gatherings for mutual edification. The order had no other organization, and what was there to organize? They carry neither purse nor bag with them on their way, neither bread nor money in their belt, not shoes on their feet. They have no churches, no convents, no fields, nor vineyards, nor animals, nor houses, nor property, nor where they can harbor their heads. They use neither fur nor linen, but only woolen habits with hoods, neither cap nor cape, nor overgarment, nor any other raiment. If anyone asks them to a meal, they eat and drink what is set before them. If anything is given them for pity, nothing is kept for the next day. And not only by their words, but by their holy life and perfect way of life, they draw many of all classes to despise the world, to leave house and home and great possessions, and put on the habit of the friars minor, which is a plain tunic and a rope around the waist. For men who lived thus, many laws and regulations were not necessary. Do the larks need more than a drink of water out of the spring, and the food they can gather in the fields, to again fly up into the sky and sing the praise of God so exultingly that all must stop and look upwards? Therefore Brother Francis loved also above all birds the bird which in everyday language is called the crested lark, and he said of it, "Sister Lark has a hood like us, and is an humble bird, for it goes willingly along the wayside and finds a grain of corn for itself. Its plumage is of the same color as the earth, and is an example to us that we shall not have fine and colored clothes, but simple and plain. But when they fly upwards, they praise God so devoutly, like good brothers of our order, whose life is in the heavens, and whose pleasure is always in glorifying God." This happy, unconfined bird life could not be forever. More and more joined the brotherhood, and not only young men came to them, but women too, married and unmarried. Even married men came. It was possible to help the young unmarried woman. They were told to enter a convent, and one of the brothers undertook temporarily to guide them and help them. But old married men came and said, "We have wives from whom we cannot separate. Teach us how to live." And they too must be looked after, but in what way? The movement Francis had awakened bid fair to mount over his head. He did not like his brothers to have the superintendence of nuns. "I am afraid the devil will give us sisters around our necks, in place of the wives we have given up for the sake of God," he may have said. And in Canara he himself had to restrain his hearers' zeal. All wished to follow him, men and women, married and unmarried, the whole population of the village. "Be not too hasty," he advised them. "I will think over what I can advise you for your salvation." The progress of the order brought great difficulties with it. Francis, on the one hand, could only rejoice at the numbers of his army, but on the other hand he had no place to harbor them in. His net, like that of the apostles, was ready to tear under the too rich draught of fishes. The rules of the order he in his time, with few and simple words, had written, would answer for wandering evangelists and musicians, but would not suffice for nuns, and still less for married people. A flock of larks Francis would willingly undertake to guide or to lead. The wild birds always gladly obeyed him. But men in the ranks of citizens, and maidens longing for the convent life, tame, useful beings, and mystic doves, that cooed in the mountain clefts of Tabor or of Carmel, how should he, simplex et idiota, the simple and foolish, give them rules of life or laws? Involuntarily, Francis looked for a helping hand. It was nearer to him than he thought. It was stretched out, white, well kept and strong, adorned with the bishop's amethyst ring, stretched out to his help by the nephew of Innocent III, the Bishop of Ostia and Velletri, Cardinal Ugolino. Chapter 5. Cardinal Ugolino. Hugo, or Ugolino, Count of Anagni, was, when Francis first knew him, a man of nearly 70 years, and of awe-inspiring and engaging appearance. He possessed all the highest polish of the day, had studied in Bologna and Paris, and was also characterized by an upright piety. His two principal interests were the freedom of the Church and the promotion of the cloister life. In 1188 he had, with danger of his life, defended the cause of the Church against the usurper Markwald, and he stood in close and permanent relations with the Camaldolites, the monks of Cluny, the congregation of St. Flor, for whom he built 2 new convents, and also later with the Franciscans and the Dominicans. In his native land, Anagni, he founded a poorhouse, with church annexed thereto, and in October 1216 gave it over to the Hospital Brothers from Alto Pascio in Tuscany. In 1198 he was papal chaplain as well as cardinal deacon with the titular church of St. Eustachio. In May 1206 he was nominated to the bishopric of Ostia and Velletri, the highest position in the church next to the Pope. It was not necessary to possess the power of a seer to see in him the coming Pope, as it is said Francis did. Also, as Gregory IX, Ugolino continued to be a true friend and benefactor of the religious orders. Among other things, he founded, with his own means, a Franciscan convent in Viterbo, and a convent for the poor Clares in Rome, San Cosmiato. In Lombardy, too, and in Tuscany, several convents owe their existence to him. To this man it fell, as his biographer puts it, to find the order of the Friars Minor in insecurity and formless, and to give it form. As already told, the first acquaintance between Francis and Ugolino dates from the summer of 1216, when the papal court was established in Perugia. No closer relations were for the present established. Next year, on May 14, 1217, Francis held his usual Pentecost chapter at Portiuncula. He had made his appearance only with grave apprehensions. On his way thither he had opened his heart to a friend. "When I now come to the chapter," said he, "the brothers ask me to preach as usual, and accordingly I do so. But what if all the brothers, when I am ready to begin, start to cry out against me? We do not want thee to rule over us any longer, for thou art not eloquent, as would become thee, and as thou oughtest to be. And thou art too small and simple, and we are ashamed to have so simple and poor-looking a superior over us, and therefore thou shalt no longer be called our supreme head." And then they will cast me out with great scorn. Anxious before the many accomplished book-learned people who now had come into the brotherhood, Francis began to preach in his usual simple way. And a wonder happened. No one called out against him. On the contrary, all the brothers were greatly edified and filled with peace. Then Francis took courage and came out with his great plan, that now, when the brothers were so many, they ought to go out on missions, not only in Italy, but also to countries on the other side of the mountains, to Germany, to Hungary, to France and Spain, yes, even to the Holy Land. This proposal was received with favor, and they started to divide, not only Italy, but also the rest of the world, into mission districts, provinces. The Holy Land was a province in itself, and over it a man was placed for whom Francis had a great liking, Elias Bombaroni. For himself he chose to go to France, because there, more than in all other Catholic countries, they have the devotion to our Lord's body. On leaving, he held one of his usual sermons of admonition, in which he counseled the brothers to go about in much silence and inward prayer, just as if you were in a hermitage or a cell. For wherever we go or stay, we have with us a cell. Brother body is our cell, and the soul sits in it like a hermit, and thinks of God, and prays to Him. In the Fioretti, this journey of Francis to France is described with many additions. What is absolutely definite is that Francis, in the latter half of May 1217, came to Florence, and there sought Cardinal Ugolino. Thomas of Celano is undoubtedly right when he says that the acquaintance between Francis and Ugolino was as yet not intimate. They had each heard the other praised for goodness and piety, and were thus prepared in advance to enter into closer friendship. Ugolino was sent by Honorius III as papal legate to Tuscany, with the double task of establishing peace between the perpetually contending republics, and to preach a crusade. As soon as Francis, on his arrival at Florence, found out that the Cardinal was there, he sought him out, simply on the principle he followed of always seeking quarters with the clergy rather than with lay people. The Cardinal received him with great cordiality, and a conversation began in which Francis lightened his burdened heart, as he had done in former days to Bishop Guido in Assisi. The end was that Francis cast himself at the feet of the Reverend Prelate and conjured him to take up his and his brother's affairs. This Ugolino promised with pleasure, and Francis, from now on, looked on him as his spiritual father, to whom he showed filial reverence and obedience. The first effect of this new relation was that Francis abandoned his journey to France. "Brother Francis," said Ugolino, "I do not want you to go over the Alps, for there are many prelates in the Curia at Rome who do not feel well disposed towards you. But I and the other cardinals, who feel well towards you, can help and protect you better if you do not go too far away." In vain did Francis plead that he could not send his brothers on missionary journeys to far and dangerous lands, while he stayed home and saved his own skin. The Cardinal was immovable, and Francis had, instead of going himself to France, to send there the verse king, Brother Pacificus, along with many other brothers. What now first of all attracted Ugolino and his organizing spirit at work was the movement which the preaching of the Friars Minor started in the world of women. Francis had taken care of Clara and her sisters by procuring for them the convent of San Damiano. He had promised to look after them, both in the spiritual and temporal sense, as long as he lived. But this promise could not be extended to include all those who now came and asked for the brothers to guide them to salvation. The form of vivendi, or rule of life, which Francis had given Clara and her sisters, simply told them to live after the gospel, that is to say, in poverty, labor, and prayer. After having distributed their possessions to the poor, the sisters in San Damiano could not again accept any property, either themselves or by an intermediary. The only exception was the convent itself, with so much land around it as was required for its isolation. But this land was not to be cultivated except as a garden for the needs of the sisters. This privilege of poverty was what Clare, apparently by Francis's intervention, in 1215 had ratified by Innocent III. This was all the rule there was for Clare and her sisters, and this rule applied, this we must note well, only to San Damiano, for the simple reason that Francis had never thought of the possibility of more convents of the same kind. Now, when there was talk of how to dispose of the many young women who gathered together in all the towns and wished to live a religious life, Ugolino was entirely free. In the course of the years 1217 through 1219, we find him therefore busy in establishing the order, which has since come to be called the Clares, but which in the documents of the time is called by the most varying names. Of the highest importance to the understanding of the evolution of the order of the Clares is a letter of August 27, 1218, from Honorius III to Ugolino. It is an answer to a letter from the Cardinal in which he had informed the Pope that several maidens and other women wished to flee from the pomps and vanities of the world and to prepare for themselves abiding places where they could live without owning anything, with the exception of these houses and the chapel or church appertaining thereto. Several pieces of land had been offered to Ugolino for this object, and now he asked for full authority to accept these pieces of land in the name of the Church of Rome, so that the convents built thereon would be out of the jurisdiction of the local bishop and directly subject to Rome. Honorius granted this authority in his answer. No other churchly or temporal authority should have anything to say about these convents, and this position of exemption should continue as long as the sisters affected by it should abide by their vow of poverty. Even before Ugolino had received this letter, Bishop John of Perugia, July 31, 1218, had given his permission for the erection of a convent for nuns of the above description upon Monteluce by Perugia. In exchange for his renunciation of his jurisdiction over the convent, he exacted only a tribute of a pound of wax, to be given every 15th of August. At about the same time, Ugolino took steps for the establishment of 3 exactly similar convents, one in Siena, outside of Porta Camolia, one in Lucca, St. Maria in Gattajola, and finally one in Monticelli, near Florence. At first, the only requirement for the religious life in these convents was poverty. It was the Franciscan preaching and the Franciscan life which had drawn these women out of the world and into the convent. When the problem was to establish a proper rule for the order for these new convents, the obvious thing for Ugolino to do was to consult the Lateran Council of 1215 and its interdiction of new orders. This great assemblage of the Church taking into consideration the so frequently proposed new orders and the resulting confusion, determined that for the future no new rules of an order should be approved by the Church, but that those who wished to found a new convent or establish a new order should be instructed to accept one of the old and tested rules. One of the first to whom this regulation applied was St. Dominic. According to John of Saxony, the Dominicans, as well as the Friars Minor, were definitely accepted by the Lateran Council, but neither of them obtained papal sanction of their rule. Dominic was even told to go home again and talk over with his brothers as to which of the rules already in existence they would decide to choose. They chose the Premonstratensian rule, and Honorius ratified this choice when he explicitly defined the Dominicans as a canonical order after the rule of St. Augustine. Exactly in the same way, Ugolino had proceeded in the case of the nuns of St. Clare. As Dominic chose the Premonstratensian rule for himself and his associates, Cardinal Ugolino now chose for the Franciscan sisters the oldest and most respected of all the rules of orders of the West, the rule of the Benedictines. What Francis expressly stood by as an inevitable basic principle, that the evangelical poverty must not be impaired, Ugolino adhered to accurately. Not once could the sisters acquire ownership of the ground on which the convents were built. They belonged to Ugolino in the name of the Church. In exactly the same spirit, Francis had not wished to own Portiuncula, but continued to regard the land as belonging to the Benedictines, and to pay them a yearly rent for it. The outlines of the rule of life of the Clares was in accordance with that of St. Benedict. They were not bound literally to this rule, as Innocent IV expressly declared at a later period. They were only in general obliged to lead a life based on obedience, poverty, and chastity. To this were added many rigid rules of cloister. The cloister could be entered by no stranger, and the active care of the sick, which, according to Jacques de Vitry, the sisters were to have practiced, must now in every case cease. It is certainly Francis who wished the rigid cloistering for preventing the meeting of his brothers and the nuns. Ugolino is said nevertheless to have wept from sympathy when he, with Francis, wrote down this requirement. After Francis's death, he modified several of the most rigid of the observances. After 1219, the Clares lived after the rule of St. Benedict, but with the addition of the so-called observances of St. Damian. In these last it is permitted to see with some degree of confidence the form of vivendi which Francis in his time had given Clara, and which now was put into the second position, but was by no means inoperative. The core of these observances, observantiae, was presumably the privilegium of poverty, which Clara, after the custom of the time, tried to have confirmed on the accession of each new pope. As long as Francis lived, there was no complete new rule given to the sisters in San Damiano, or to the community of poor Clares in general. It was only after the death of Francis that Gregory IX tried to introduce modifications, first of all in the regulation of poverty. On account of the unfavorable times, it might be well to own a little land on which the convent could be firmly founded, instead of depending entirely on begging. These views of his he also brought to the attention of Clara, but was definitely refused. On September 17, 1228, Clara obtained from Gregory, as she had from his predecessor, the privilege of poverty. The Clares in Perugia had their privilege renewed June 16, 1229, and Clara's sister Agnes obtained the same for her convent of Monticelli near Florence. Other convents were less constant, however. Many of them in this very year had the right of ownership granted by Gregory, and not only the right of usufruct, but of inheritance and owning. This defection filled Clara with anxiety and sorrow. As long as she lived, San Damiano would remain the fortified tower of supreme poverty. But how was it to be when she was gone? Thence came her ardor for replacing the Benedictine rule and its proportion of the privilege of poverty with a completely new, real Franciscan rule of the order. There can be no doubt that she herself wrote it, and that it was the one which Innocent IV ratified 2 days before her death. This rule is, as far as possible, modeled on the Franciscan rule. Like it is divided into 12 chapters, each of them not greatly differing from Ugolino's and Francis's rule of 1219. But the point on which Clara's rule is based is in the very first place the obligation of poverty. As she came to this section, she ceased to be the impersonal lawgiver and began to speak from her heart. After the Heavenly Father, she writes, had enlightened my heart with His grace, and had led me in the model of our most holy Father Francis on the way of penance, shortly after his own conversion, then I and my sisters promised him willing obedience. And as she turned her thoughts to these times, now so remote, when she first said goodbye to the world, one recollection after another pressed upon her. She remembered so many words that came from the mouth of the dear teacher and guide, addressed to the honor of his lady, the noble Lady Poverty, and wrote them down. And with strong hand she impressed the sentence, in which the ideal claim appears on record in all its rigor, beyond all appeal. The sisters shall own neither house, nor convent, nor anything, but as strangers and pilgrims shall wander through this world, serving the Lord in poverty and humility. Under these words, as Clara was closing her eyes in death, Innocent set the inviolable seal of Rome.